Hey guys, it's Mexi. Welcome to another video. I got a new camera, so hopefully this is going to work out. So today I wanted to talk about, I wanted to do like a broad overview of what my research is about. I focus mostly on neoliberal conservation, or basically why neoliberal conservation is like hopelessly futile and unsustainable and just horrible in so many ways. So I'll probably do like a series of videos where I look at each specific kind of part of neoliberal conservation or like the different ways that it actually plays out. But today I'm just going to do kind of like a broad introduction overview. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. So for any good discussion of neoliberalism, I'm going to start with capitalism and look at the relationship between capitalism and environmental degradation, or the crises, environmental crises that we're facing today, like climate change, etc. So as I've mentioned in other videos, profit is only generated in a capitalist society through exploitation of laborers and exploitation of resources or the environment. If you don't know what I mean by that, then check out my previous video on redistribution. I'll link it below. You should probably just like start there and then come back to this so that you fully understand what I mean by exploitation. But, you know, at its most basic level, capital is obviously produced in part by digging up resources, turning them into goods or commodities, and distributing them around the globe, usually relying on fossil fuel energy to produce and distribute this, so obviously contributing to climate change on like a big scale. So, you know, this large-scale global environmental degradation really started to occur during the Industrial Revolution, after we saw the enclosure movement and we saw the creation of factories. And you know, by the way, these industrializing nations like in Europe wouldn't have got anywhere if they weren't exploiting the colonies, so exploiting basically slave labor in the colonies and exploiting the resources of the colonies. And of course, you know, production and consumption being organized around competition. Competition basically forces even the most environmentally conscious and socially responsible capitalists to put that downward pressure on costs, and so choose the cheapest possible option, which usually means the most environmentally detrimental option, right? Another reason that capitalism as a system is so inherently destructive is because it relies on exchange values, not inherent use values. So, you know, what I mean by that is like, let's say I need a chair, I go and I have one chair made by someone who makes a chair, and perhaps I produce something of value that that person wants, something like that, right? We're not producing things based on need or use value. We're producing things based on exchange value. And so we're producing like millions and millions and millions of chairs, or millions and millions and millions of whatever the hell we're creating. And we're doing that for their exchange value, so just the value of exchange on the market. So big corporations, you know, produce vast amounts of things that we don't really need, pretend like, you know, sell it to us as if we really do need them. And then there's the whole bit about, you know, planned obsolescence, where you know, things are planned to only last a year or 2 years or whatever, so that you have to replace them. So it's a system that promotes continual consumption and continual wastage just to keep the system going, right? I'll link below a really good lecture by David Harvey. He's talking about capital as value in motion. It's amazing, but he discusses in it how, you know, the system has to continually be in motion and continually grow in order to avoid just catastrophic crises or slow down stagnation, etc., etc. So all of these things have to be produced and then moved, and continually moved, so that the profits can continue to be generated and the system can continue to grow. And, you know, it's very obvious even just thinking about a system like that based on continual growth and continually producing things that we don't need, and making people think that they need to waste them as soon as possible. Something like that is never really going to be sustainable on a finite planet with finite resources, right? Like that's not a very difficult concept to grasp, right? So I mentioned this briefly in my Trump video as well, that capitalism will run into these crises anyway. It's an inherently violent and contradictory and crisis-ridden system, so it will run into crises anyway. But the two main crises that it will run into just by going along its own business, trying to grow and reproduce itself. Sorry, the battery died on my camera, so I have to switch to my phone. so hopefully this is okay. So anyway, capitalism, just operating as a system, runs into two main inherent crises. The first is the crisis of overproduction, as I mentioned in my previous video, which is you've saturated the market and there's no one else to buy what you're selling, or you've put such a downward pressure on wages that people can't afford what you're selling, and so this leads to a slowdown of that motion that needs to happen to keep growth and accumulation happening. Number two is the environmental crisis. So basically you deplete the resources that you need for production and thus run into a crisis. So neoliberalism, as I mentioned again in the Trump video, is something that provides a kind of like environmental and social, but I'm going to focus on environmental today, environmental fix for this crisis of capitalism. And it does that in a series of ways. So number one, obviously it allows you to outsource your production where there are fewer environmental regulations, and in that sense you're also outsourcing your waste, like the waste that comes from the production of your commodity. Number two is just the attack of regulations of all kind, including environmental regulations at home, and we can see that right now with President Trump trying to like repeal and remove all of these regulations that would otherwise protect people from environmental harm, like environmental justice issues, but also just climate change in general, which is an increasing concern. I've actually made a video about climate change, so I'll link that below as well, if anyone is wondering why this is such a pressing and disastrous issue. Number three, trade deals, so like free trade deals or world trade law or whatever, allows foreign multinational companies to sue governments in a secret tribunal outside of our judicial system if we put into place any regulations that would impede their profit. So like in Canada, if we put in regulations around like the tar sands, we could have foreign companies suing us for doing this, which is absolutely insane. Ontario actually had like a really great local solar program, but it was completely squashed because it violated world trade law, which is like, what the fuck? Like, we're impeding our own progress, like seriously impeding it. And number four is kind of the creation of this whole neoliberal conservation concept, or these new market-based mechanisms to address the environmental problem, basically turning what would otherwise be the negative externalities of capitalism, like environmental degradation and pollution and things like that, turning those things into actually new avenues for investment and growth and accumulation. So again, this is like a fix for the crisis of the second crisis of capitalism, right? But I'm going to explain why this is a terrible fix and why it's not solving the problem, it's just kind of like moving around the crises and just actually prolonging and delaying the problem. So for example, we have the emergence of, offsets and offset markets and things like that, and Red Plus, if you're familiar with that. And so these are all based on turning ecosystems into metrics, basically, which is highly, highly problematic because obviously, we can't put a price on every single thing that each organism does within an ecosystem. And more often than not, things are completely missed, right? Like, look at what's happening with the bees. Nobody really valued their unpaid labor that they were doing to help the production of agricultural products, and suddenly they're all dying out. Everyone's like, shit, we're not gonna have food if the bees aren't doing their job, if they're not healthy, right? So a lot of things are missed. Like, we can't possibly turn everything into a metric that can be calculated, and it relies on the idea that, an ecosystem here can be made equal to an ecosystem somewhere totally far away and perhaps even into the future. So there's a lot of assuming going on, there's a lot of problematic assumption going on. And it's also based on the idea that development or growth is just inevitable. And so it's not actually about saving or restoring or, thinking about how to conduct business sustainably. It's just thinking about how to allow the current status quo of degradation and capital accumulation to keep going unfettered. And at best just like mitigate what's going on. But there's not a lot of good science that even shows that, saving this very distant piece of land and continuing to emit as much as we're emitting over here in developed nations is actually going to, even out, or if it's actually going to really mitigate anything, right? I can link some some good articles below, or maybe I'll do that in a following video when I go deeper into these kind of topics. But yeah, it's insanely problematic. And if you think about like Red Plus, it's insane. It becomes really problematic because basically it's just wealthy nations or like industrialized companies, etc., buying up land to use as offsets in the global south, and usually buying it up in, you know, inhabited forests. So we have indigenous people who are contributing, you know, the least to climate change or environmental degradation, and they're being, you know, their land is being bought up or used in these offset markets, and so they are very restricted now as to how they can even live their lives. So they are shouldering the main burden of environmental conservation, while the rich nations are not being asked to change whatsoever. They're not being asked to confront this capitalist system that is causing the degradation in the first place. So some other examples would be like payments for environmental schemes or ecotourism or bioprospecting or things like that. And I don't think I'm gonna have time to talk about all of them today, so maybe I'll make some more videos about that. But basically what they have in common is that they all ignore these underlying political economic reasons why degradation is happening in the first place and try to just work within this system to create change. But you know, it's like capitalist markets cannot be the answers to their own ecological contradictions. And similarly, like, you can't fight the problems caused by consumption through increased consumption, right? It's just, you can't fight capitalism with capitalism. It's like it doesn't work. It's futile, right? It's like all these companies donating to conservation like after the fact. Like Coca-Cola, you see them donating so much to the Arctic and Arctic preservation, right? But if you think about like how much degradation and how much emissions Coke as a company puts out in the world, and how much they are contributing to climate change and the complete, you know, degradation of Arctic environments, to then take all that money that you made by destroying the environment and try to throw it back at the problem after the fact. It's like, what are you even paying for? Like, this has become such an issue that like we can't even solve this with money, right? Like, if you actually wanted to help the Arctic, then you would take that money and invest it in turning your production system into like a totally carbon neutral kind of sustainable thing. But if you think about even like how much, like, you know, they have to have the, you know, carbon-based plastic bottles, and then you have to distribute that all around the globe, like how much are you emitting through all of that, right? It's like if you actually wanted to help the Arctic, you would actually just shut down your production, right? And like, again, you're not producing Coke because of its inherent use value. You're just creating like a billion Cokes and then convincing people that like Coke is something they really need in their life, right? But it's, you know, it's obviously not a necessity for life. That kind of a model is not sustainable, and it's never actually going to get us very far. If we're not actually confronting capitalism as a global system and radically revolutionizing our political economic system, then we are never going to be sustainable in environmental terms, right? Like, we're always going to run up against these crises and these limits, and pretty soon, if you watch my climate change video, you'll see like pretty soon climate change could become a runaway train, and then we're totally screwed. So it's really, really problematic that our global institutions and everyone has really embraced this idea that capitalism is somehow compatible with environmental sustainability. It absolutely is not. So basically, sorry if that's depressing to you. Yeah, I was basically pretty depressed most of my like undergrad and graduate degree learning about all of this. But at the same time, it's so important, and we have to, like, we can't just keep pretending that we can go on like this any longer. Like, we can't just keep pretending like, oh no, it's okay, like the corporations or like the free market's gonna work itself out. Like, inherently, like systematically, this is not possible, and we need to confront that. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like, subscribe, leave me a comment, and I'll see you in another video.